Okay, we're all here. Restarting the recording. So again, welcome everybody. This is intended to be a series mostly laying the problem as I see it in the first session, and then I hope to delve into solutions, or at least trails towards solutions in the subsequent seminars. I will probably talk a bit more this one because I'm trying to give a coherent picture of the problem space. But I do hope that do ask questions if needed, and I hope to make this more interactive as the series progresses. So, trying to do. So the big vision, the big plan is using collective intelligence to solve world problems. We have plenty of those. And I do think that getting people to think together rather than individually would help not only find better solutions, but also work together better towards making those solutions happen. The model of collective intelligence I'm using was designed by Simon Buckingham-Shum. There's many definitions of collective intelligence. And he said, you know, when a group of people joins forces to not only sense the environment together, but make sense, interpret it, the sense-making part, collective sense-making, generating good options, good ideas, ideation, collective ideation. And that means building on one another's ideas. And this is way beyond crowdsourcing, that way where you choose among the best idea any one individual had. Taking decisions together and coordinating action. And of course, this is intended, it's written as an arrow here, but it was quickly modified to become a spiral because of course it's a learning loop. From actions, you sense what happened and you hopefully collectively learn more about what's possible. So this is what we're trying to do. And I really want to insist on the large scale collective intelligence side. We have a lot of good techniques for doing teamwork and thinking together in smallish groups. But can any of those techniques scale up to the point of deliberative democracy, which is part of the ultimate aim? But even without being so ambitious, I think that there's a lot to be done to increase the capacity of small to medium to large size groups to coordinate understanding so as to coordinate action. And the argument underlying the whole work is that to have this collective intelligence, you need to have a common understanding, a kind of global knowledge cartography. People need to understand what other people understand. And that requires a certain level of precision when discussing concepts. We're often, of course, we're limited because we don't have the same beliefs or aims or all of that, but also because it's sometimes even hard to communicate about those beliefs or aims, and having a better idea of where the person is coming from is, I think, one of the basis of having better collective intelligence. And this is something I've been thinking about for a long time, and it's not my first project in that I've worked on something that was first known as Assemble, still exists, though it's very different from what I designed. My own fork is now Idealoom. And the way, there's still principles of lessons learned from that project. So I want to quickly give an idea of what it was. It's sense-making from a conversation. So there was a kind of web forum, and some designated people would extract key concepts from the conversation and cluster them into idea tree, in outline form. And so that instead of just having what's just been said and the newer as we have in the social media, we'd be able to extract ideas and build certain understanding from that conversation. And that project, we already had the idea when I was part of that team, that it had to be part of a group of collective intelligence tools. I don't think there's ever going to be one tool to rule them all. We want to represent a diversity of ideas and diversity of approaches, and that does mean a diversity of use cases and tools to fill those use cases. So we thought about having, at the time, something called the Catalyst Interpretability Format for this ecosystem. And so that was done. It worked up to a point. It's still being used, but not so much the format, but the original tool, as I said, heavily transformed. But there were many, what I saw as major design flaws in the original plan. Because it's a tree, it's harder to do cross-concern comparison, but more important, it's a single data structure describing the emerging ideas, which means that ultimately it's a single viewpoint, and I'll come back to that a lot. So it was limited as a collaboration tool. And as for the collective, the format, well, it was a kind of batch transformation format, and it did not allow for very fluid interoperability between the tools. And that got me to worry about event sourcing, and I'll have a lot. So if we're thinking about large-scale collaboration, what does it really entail? We know that language is essentially sequential. We have speech acts that build on one another and build on assumptions introduced in previous speech acts. And if you're collaborating on a long-form document, any intervention risks breaking the sequence. And if you have more editors, you have more breaks in the sequence. And it's very hard to maintain the sequential coherence of a long-form document. If you look at tools that enable large-scale group collaboration, such as wikis, well, one solution they found is to break down the long-form document into smaller units, which allow independent edits and are not so strongly connected that addition of one risks endangering the semantic neighborhood. And this tendency is in a way going further with Rome and similar editors. Jury is working on one of those small text units that have independent meanings. And so is Michael. A lot of people are working on small text-based sense-making tools. And I think there's huge value there for personal and small group sense-making. For large-scale edition, of course, because it's smaller, it's possible to do edits with less impact. And that's wonderful. But there is a limit to how coherent they are, because it's broken down smaller. It doesn't have the same coherence as a long-form text. And the other thing is, if you want to make smaller units at some point, and you think of them more as small units, it becomes appropriate to think of them more as graph form than text form. And not necessarily, I think you need both actually, but I just want to introduce the fact that dialogue maps have been used for a long time. Jeff Conklin especially popularized the notion of dialogue maps as a liminal object in conversations. So what he would do is he would have people in a room discussing contentious issues, wicked conversations, and he would draw a graph of the various arguments, positions, and having this boundary object out there help diffuse tension. Like instead of people aggressively answering the other person, they could look at the wall and look at the map and say, oh, that's what you're saying, which was more difficult in simple one-to-one or in a group context, which was difficult in the group context. And I believe hugely in the value of dialogue maps. They worked really well in that context. And one reason they worked is that they also are a sense-making unit. In that context, you have one skilled map maker who curates the map as something that makes sense as a whole. It was tried to do these, yes, thank you. The Conklin book is absolutely wonderful reading. It was tried to put these dialogue maps in offline and let people edit them. And very soon the impact was a ball of yarn. A, because people didn't necessarily have the skill to maintain the coherence of a dialogue map. Like doing a good map is a skill, but also because it was too many perspectives layered onto one another, and you had a very quickly a ball of yarn effect. And that's always the problem when you scale up. So I think that when we speak about knowledge graphs, dialogue maps, I'm using terms loosely here. It's what went into a knowledge graph usually came from language, from text. And they're often expressed as language. And I'm not trying to replace language here. But can we augment the valid linear storytelling mode of language that tells one story well with a more global concept cartography? Can we embed a local coherent dialogue map into the ball of yarn, which is the reality of what everybody's thinking, but in a way that we show the embedding and we show the neighborhood, and we can make that embedding carry its own meaning? That's what the aim is long-term. So anchor concepts in text, explain them as text. But even when you're just allowing people to edit their curated view, which again, I think is important and valuable, that a single point of view is meaningful. When people read it, they'll be layering interpretations on it and putting all those multiple layers of interpretation in the text itself. You can get the ball of yarn effect in text, or you can try to do it as markup and annotations. And again, if all the annotations are overlaid on one text, if you try to do it as markup, it becomes unmanageable markup. And you need layers, you need filters, you need curated views. And so it's not just markup, we need offline annotation and what Engelbart called USPECs, really, to control how much is seen of the multiple layers of interpretation over text. The other thing about concept graphs and annotation in general, I mean, concept maps are a step toward a formal language. It's an acquired skill, as I said, and we can't expect participants in a public forum or a public discourse or deliberative democracy to have high skill in any formal system at all. So any system that aims to serve the public has this constraint of it should be able to accept informal contribution that can be progressively incorporated, progressively formalized into a more knowledge graph-y data structure. However, that graph representation or that formal representation may not be a graph, but the more formal representation must be legible enough that somebody without too much training can at least recognize, has my contribution been incorporated accurately, and if not, but what's wrong, and can I at least say that something's wrong? That's really important for participants. Now, we're speaking about putting all these concepts in a map and using language as an anchor, but natural language is ambiguous. That's inherent. Meaning of words is disputed. Like I often give the example of socialism. If you speak about socialism, do you mean socialism as was defined and intended by Karl Marx, by Bernie Sanders, or by Mitch McConnell? I mean, these are three probably totally distinct concepts. And there's a lineage and affiliation you can draw between them, but they're distinct concepts. And if you try to make statements that apply to all three, there's very little you can say that's meaningful. And this is even more true with emerging concepts. There's disputed concepts and there's emerging concepts where we're still trying to know what is true of that concept. And when we want to do a knowledge map and knowledge cartography in general to align objectives and beliefs, we need to resolve the ambiguity. And again, progressively and at need, as we do in language, we all use ambiguous terms, and it's okay until it isn't. And that's human communication. And I think this is like trying to be ultra precise beforehand is an obstacle to contributions. But being able to be more precise is vital to clear communication. And being more formal isn't a panacea. Like there's been a lot of attempts to say Okay, let's use this formal concept instead of this informal concept. And then, okay, what do you mean by faux friend, the RDF identifier, as opposed to the English word friend? It's there's also multiple interpretations of meaning. And the reality is, when we're dealing with communication, any form of communication, verbal, formal, written, we're just piling concepts on concepts. Symbols on symbols. We don't have access to the concepts. Open my skull, you won't find concepts. So this many-to-many representation between, in Peirce's terms, sign carriers to signifiers to external objects, if any, or in topic mapping terms, how occurrences map to topics or proxies for topics. These are vocabularies for the fact that there's this many correspondence between symbols and concepts, and we don't have access to concepts. We just have more symbols. So what can we do given that all what we have is symbols? And again, that need not be a problem. Definitions are there's one big school of linguistics that says, symbols have contextual meaning. That is, the meaning of a symbol is in a way given by all the contexts it's part of. That's a certain view of language. But that's not practical from, of course, in a way it is. That's how we learned language, right? We learned language by context, but we do not have access to the full corpus of all human utterances. So what we do is we create micro-languages in the formal world. So ontologies are small curated sets of related concepts, and they make sense of microdomain, and it's a coherent whole. But there's downsides to ontologies. Of course, one ontology expresses one viewpoint, one way of understanding the world. Crafting an ontology requires skill, and evolving an ontology requires even more skill. The ontology has to be logically consistent in a way that language doesn't, and maintain consistency to its evolution. And if you're connecting, you want to connect multiple points of view, so you want to connect ontology, there's such a thing as ontology alignment. But again, you want to preserve consistency because it's a logical language. And so that's even more skill. So that's rigid and unwieldy in some ways. And some people have reacted so far against ontologies that they've gone totally the other way towards folksonomies, where basically people use tags to name concepts, and whatever tag is popular is a concept, and that is very flexible. It allows quick evolution and emergence, but you've lost all the structure that ontology gave you. And I think that's really a problem, again, for clear communication. So the question is, can we apply progressive formalization to ontologies, to ontology creation, ontology alignment? If we say we each have our micro vocabulary of theories of the world, can we align those theories of the world? And to do that, you need a rich meta model of meta statements. Like a lot of systems for belief alignment focus on claims, I believe this, you believe that. And if you look at ontology alignment, it's even more simplistic. It's binary relations, which are true or false, and basically saying this concept is this class, because we're speaking about class and ontologies, are the same as this one. It's a subclass of, or it's vaguely related, which doesn't help much in SCOS. But that's because we have a very simplistic vocabulary, and we have a very simplistic model, because RDF, one thing RDF is missing, RDF is one important ontology building language, is statements about statements. It's possible to do it. There's new formalisms. There's an extension of RDF called RDF star that is still a draft. It's very marginal, and RDF itself is still considered marginal by a lot of people. So, it's a niche of a niche. There's also work by Joshua Chinevier of Uber on algebraic property graphs that allows this notion that I'm calling recursive hypergraphs, the notion of being able to make statements about statements about statements. And I think extremely important to be able to make such statements. And the key statements are equivalence and distinction. Now, equivalence in logic is pure equality. And here I'm speaking about something a bit less rigid. It's, you know, this is equivalent with respect to a domain and with respect to a common abstraction. So again, this is not, it's a ternary relationship at this point. It's not a binary relationship. And distinction, same thing. If you say two concepts are distinct, what are their respective domains of application? What are the distinguishing characteristic? The claims that are true of this version, not of that version. It's about systematically saying this is different with respect to something. So the key principles I'm trying to get across here are claims are language acts, and as such, they have to be referenceable. That means they have a unique immutable identity as a language act, but their interpretations vary endlessly. And that means that when you have an identifier for a concept or an identifier for a claim, you need to constantly ask the system, what's happened to that concept since last time I looked at it? Did somebody introduce a new distinction? Did somebody introduce a new equivalence? The merge and forks of conceptual units. And we need to be able to revisit the history, past and subsequent, of any concept that we have a pointer to. And that way, the notion of being able to use concept identifiers and being able to use them forever is really what I want to get people out of the habit of, and saying in a federated context, we're always renegotiating our identifiers. And the other important thing is the resulting identity metastatements, this equivalence and distinctions, they don't have an absolute truth value, true or false. They have a social truth value in a federation. Okay, social truth values, that's a key notion. If I, in my own internal beliefs or in my own knowledge graph, as I try to express my internal beliefs as a knowledge artifact, text or graph or whatever, I probably believe I have well-defined concepts, which may turn out not to be so clear when I discuss it, but at a given moment, I have a belief that I have a clear notion about what concepts mean, or what symbols mean, and what concepts I'm dealing with. And that means I'm able to assign truth values to various statements. And in some cases, it's not just true or false. There's open question, unknown, possibly, probably, and I may be the kind of person who assigns Bayesian probabilities to statements, very rare, but they do exist. But this is all from a single viewpoint. There's a kind of definiteness, even to a probabilistic assessment. In a social context, and I think that's extremely important, this is just not individual. We have, for example, the College of Epidemiologists is able to say what they believe about what the vaccine, the risk and benefits of the vaccine as a community, even if it doesn't exactly match the belief of each of the members of the community. It means they have a social process for being able to make statements as a community. And different communities have different social processes. It can be democracy, it can be autocracy, it can be consensus, it can be unanimity, it can be some quorum, or if their community beliefs are put on a Google Doc, it can be last that it wins among a small circle group of editors. But anyway, there's a social process to be able to say this community is able to hold certain beliefs as a whole. But when we're speaking about a federation, we have a global federation, world or country or much larger scale. We don't have such social processes. And even in human groups, we don't necessarily have a social process. So what we have is a kind of more a distribution of individual beliefs. And what I mean by a social truth value is being able to express distribution of beliefs and making that the truth values, whether of the claims or of the identity metaclaims. And what this distribution should allow is to be able to distinguish consensus versus polarizing versus fringe claims. And thus, when you ask what happened to this concept, you expect a kind of soft core consensus with maybe polarizing and certainly fringe. I mean, there will be versions that you want to be able to say, well, in my belief system, I want to exclude this fringe belief because I think it makes no sense. But it still exists in the federation. And one thing that I think is really important is when you're dealing with a federation and a social belief formation system, it's not enough to have one answer. It's not enough to say this is, but on the other hand, it's important that the system doesn't become a tool for spreading misinformation, because anything that is actually used to guide decisions will be targeted with disinformation. That's just a given. So you don't want to exclude disinformation with gatekeepers, because that breaks down a certain trust in that the system is inclusive. But you don't want to propagate, and that means you start to have a reputation system, a trust system, and to be able to rank beliefs by what kind of community believes that. And what you want to do is, especially if you want to, of course, when you have an algorithm, the algorithm will be gamed. And so what you want to do, and that's something we're discussing in one of many groups I'm discussing with, is actually you need many measures, because any one measure will be gamed. But if you have a variety of measures, it's harder to game them all. So I don't think it's in scope for me to say this is the right measure of evaluating truth. I don't think that such a thing is possible. However, I think that we need the HyperKnowledge protocol to have this notion that you will have many ways of ranking different claims. And those claims should include at least a few mechanisms, such as you should not allow objections without justification. Now, of course, again, we just had a conversation in the Canonical Debate Lab about this. It's a bit more subtle than that, because if you don't need to justify something that is a consensus truth, what you should do is justify contentious truths and ground them in consensus truths. But in general, yes, Drew?
Yes, that's a very important point. That I think the thing is that the consensus statements has to show chain of claims.
Yes, absolutely.
So even if it's a consensus, if it doesn't have a chain of claim or context, it's an unfair advantage. It's unexaminable, and it doesn't allow us to discover that the consensus is wrong, because basically the majority is always wrong.
Let me make a nuance to that. I agree with the principle, but I'm saying basically if the consensus is unopposed, I don't think it's necessary to justify it, because then you'll justify it by something which needs justification, and it's an infinite chain, turtles all the way down.
No,
what I'm saying is that as a heuristic, when you have an unopposed consensus claim, you can stop until it gets opposed. Then you have to justify it.
Sorry. I think a better rule, this is just a suggestion, better rule is that any claim should have at least 2 levels of from the speakers, and it's never an infinite regress. Okay, but
because if it's
we don't have infinite attention.
That's true, but what I'm saying is because it should not be, because we don't have infinite attention, it should not be infinite regress, and then thus I cannot ask that every claim be justified.
No, you can ask every speaker to at least show the neighborhood that he's thinking.
I think that is reasonable. However, the key claims need at least some justification. Sure. But what I'm saying is the key claim in one context is the fringe claim in another. And in the system as a whole, I have to allow ungrounded truths.
Yes, of course, but that's the edges. But don't allow anybody to speak like that. That's what I mean.
Fair enough.
That's why I jumped in. You shouldn't have consensus just because it is consensus. Nobody should talk without some articulation about anything. And of course, don't follow it up because that's infinite. But at least be coherent in the speech.
Right. No, that does make sense. I mean, I think there's a lot, and that's what I mean by there should be many rules. There should be many heuristics, and this should be an experimental space. I'm trying to give ideas of what such rules should follow. I think asking for justification is very important. It's just as I said, distinction should be grounded in a distinguishing characteristic, and ideally also in a context or a common abstraction, if appropriate. And in terms of personal reputation, I think that Tetlock has done wonderful work of evaluating, for example, forecasting quality, and this is a good measure of being able to say, to claim a valid understanding of a domain. But of course, that also requires that we're able to verify that the prediction happened in the real world. That means we have an agreed upon real world. It's becoming problematic at this point. But I think that having a grounding in some level of reality is still not a totally unrealistic goal. And the third principle I want to introduce is a lot of what I've been speaking about is creating new distinctions and creating new between concepts. But I think it's also important to have synthesizing definitions and to promote those, to say if like you don't want an infinite explosion and atomization of concept, you want to have convergence as well as divergence, and having heuristics that favor synthesis, I think is extremely important. Now, of course, there's all this work in other domains about identity and real world identity and unreproducible chain of claims in the blockchain and so on in the distributed web. That is all relevant to a reputation system. In a way, that's another layer. Like there's a layer which is defining the terms, and there's a layer of the reputation system. I don't think the first layer can work well without the second, because you need to be able to cut the chain off. You need to be able to order claims so as to not favor disinformation. But on the other hand, reputation has all these other requirements. And the other point I want to make is the question of federation centralization. First, I keep speaking about a protocol and data model rather than a system. Because I want to leverage claims wherever they come from. Making one system means asking people to adopt that system, whereas claims are made in ontologies and documents, in immutable or mutable documents, conversations. Those are all valid sources, but ideal HyperKnowledge source should have the notion of this is how claims evolved, and this is the history of the evolution of the claim. And being able to graft that to other type of source becomes important, even if it's a degenerate history we had this point of time, which is the publication of this document. We could combine all of this in a central database. There's a problem of scale and the cost of large scale. And I think there's also a problem with this will only be adopted at best by people who are willing to engage in public discourse and accepted public discourse. And I think it's important to promote guerrilla adoption of such a system. So I'm very much aiming for either small server or totally serverless distributed web solutions, at least as one layer of the individual what Jerry calls personal knowledge graph system, even though the federation may require more infrastructure. And the problem, of course, with disconnected nodes is that they can remain disconnected. So the question is how to allow this federation between the nodes, the fractal, because I think the individual community link is extremely important, and the community to super community and so on, but also rhizomal, also horizontal federation. And so the kind of vague roadmap I have in mind is, so each node would represent one or possibly many viewpoints expressed as an event source of claims, history of statements, and the claims define concept. And so it keeps track of a certain number of concepts and their identity history. And it will know that it has received statements from other nodes, ideally. And as such, it will receive some of those synthesis nodes. And each node, the core of the claim is immutable kernel. But when it's emitted by someone should say, I'm proposing this as an improved version of this claim, this claim, this claim, this claim, or this concept definition, that concept definition. And by stating as a person, this is what I'm trying to improve on, if this synthesis gets adopted and accepted, especially by the people whose claim it's trying to replace, it will get promoted and spread the awareness of these other versions. So it gets promoted, it gets adopted, and so my node becomes aware of the existence of those other nodes because I've incorporated this claim that says, oh, by the way, I'm supposed to be improving on those other claims and those other nodes. So for each claim, it's about keeping track of the claims it tries to integrate and the integrations which are acknowledged. So we can ask that way, we can do a kind of graph walk, given one expression of a concept. What has it been integrated in, and what other versions exist that are missing in that version? And the idea is to have a kind of histogram, possibly using Bloom filters, of these are all the hashes of statements which are known to be equivalent to this one. And so you could compare hashes and say, okay, this one has a lot of on bits in the Bloom filter, which are not on in this one. So it's probably quite different. So let's look at this one next. And so we could have a kind of live chain of who do we ask next for expanding the point of view. And we could also look at adoption weight as a priority so we prioritize well-adopted versions as opposed to non-well-adopted versions. There's a lot of hand waving there. This is not a complete algorithm. I don't claim it is. It's a research program, is how to describe the algorithm. What I intend, well, first, what I hope I've really helped build the link into why we need this fractal federation of viewpoints to identify if you and I try to agree on something, to know, oh, if we disagree, what is the most likely origin of the disagreement in terms of possible misinterpretation? What is the possible point of disagreement? What is the contentious polarizing claim that is implicit in the concepts we're using? Being able to do that, I think, would be a huge help for any kind of coordination, action matchmaking, and knowledge alignment in general, and viewpoint cartography. So I hope you see why all this machinery that I'm describing. There's a lot of open questions. Again, this is not an existing system, it's a research program. But I have beginning of answers like this algorithm I described. I did say there's our hand waving, but it's still hand waving around a kernel. And I have kernel for many of those elements. This is what those kernels, and I'll get more technical and hopefully more interactive, are what I want to examine in the further seminars. But I wanted to really lay the grand perspective today. So that is what I had to say, and questions or comments or specific, maybe objections or distinctions.
Just one comment, you're trying to solve many problems at once, and I guess you're aware of that.
I am.
Right? Yeah, and as I usually tell you,
layers.
Divide and conquer somehow.
I'm always, well, I think that that's a very good point. I'm trying to find the points to carve the system. And already Stephen of Canonical Debate Lab has helped us distinguish the claim layer from the scoring layer. And I think that's already a huge.
What? Sorry, I didn't. The claim layer, and what was the other one?
The scoring layer.
Scoring. Okay.
I think it's hard to totally distinguish them, because if you don't have scoring, your claim request will be potentially endless. On the other hand, it is still possible to define them separately, and doesn't matter in practice if it's practically endless, because it's not theoretically endless. And I think that it is possible, and in a way, the plan for these next 4 seminars is a kind of layering that I'm proposing. I think that we need first a data model for meta claims. I mean, are we just adopting RDF star? No, I don't think so. I'm proposing a syntax, a kind of extended syntax for meta claims. So that's one thing I'm doing. And then can we express the identity meta claims using that data model? And then how do I express social truth values? And probably there should be another layer on scoring above that. And then we can speak about the mechanics of federated event sourcing and in concrete computer systems. So already this is an attempt at layering. I don't know if it answers your question.
Yeah, like, I mean, you covered the I'm sorry, Jerry.
Yeah. No. I mean, I'm totally against layers. We had 50 years of layered thinking and layer systems building, and we've been building cathedrals out of cardboard boxes without actually really thinking about the big picture. So I think it's just the wrong way. We had 50 years of that. So I think it's time to start something better. I think that's really just a knee-jerk reaction. I recommend everybody to read this one. It's a really good one on that topic. But that's I put a couple of questions in the chat.
Blank predicates, if you like, and apply the same constrained thinking to them. I think I'll want you to rephrase the questions, because they're more themes than questions.
No, so sorry, see, it goes back. So what I was trying to say is that it's not just claims, but simply associations that some human being found that, meaningful it's there. And I really want to point to Jerry's brain, which has no claims whatsoever. It's only pure association and how rich and useful it is. And what I'm saying, that the very same logic or the very same vision that you have, I know about it, it should really be extended to encompass some of that. And the very same event-based stuff could really surface interesting things, even if it is not a claim level. And some of these things become claims. I mean, I know from my own work that it may take 3 years to find the right predicate. And the idea was there, the tacit, this is the tacit association. It's relevant. It may take you years to figure out why and what it means. I mean, remember the classic example is this concept of the transitional modeling. It just really articulated something that everybody, a lot of people thought about. But it takes, it takes time to come up with the right concept, where although there is a relevant, significant association. And this is really inspired by the work you did with the society library, because that's what, you know, they extracting claims, but they could actually mine it for just associations. Obviously, this is what all the recommendations engines do. You know, they don't really break. Yeah.
Let me answer that. On the one hand, of course, you're right. On claims, okay, I think this falls under what I was calling progressive formalization, in the sense that an association is undefined. We don't know exactly what form it takes. But I do think that encouraging, nudging people to go from this, I think this is relevant to that, encouraging them to say how it's relevant and what is the claim behind it.
Absolutely.
Really is it's like asking people to give reasons for their beliefs or objections. It's the same principle. It's asking people to go towards formalization. Where I do agree also is I speak a lot about predictions and reputation. People must be allowed and encouraged to be tentative about these things. I don't want to punish people for making thought experiments, and that's extremely important in any system. People need to take risks. And I think, and by the way, I think I speak a lot of event streams related to the assertions of one individual or one community, but there's also, I think, sub-individual event streams, which are, let me make a thought experiment, assume that this is true and see where it leads me. And that's an event stream. And all of these things are hypotheticals. They're not claims. They're, you know, subjective world claims or micro-domain claims or things like that, right? And I think it's important to be able to divide one's mental spaces that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Anything else? In a way, this was because it's the intro, I think you've heard a lot of this before, a lot of you. But I hope I've given at least some elements of new developments. Certainly the one about concept identity is comparatively recent, and I know at least Robert hasn't heard that before.
It's helpful to have it an overview and all in one place, kind of. So thanks.
Really apologies for this.
And I apologize. I have a meeting at the top of the hour. I bid adieu.
That's fine. I mean, I did schedule this for an hour. I can stay as you wish. It's
just I was going to ask a question about the state of this thinking, and this may be in you know, subsequent meetings, but the state of the physical representation of this thinking, you know,
it's still
wireframes, mock-ups, or not.
It's
or prototypes.
No, what I have at this point is experiments with syntax. And so that's not quite at the wireframe level. I have ideas about visualization of hypergraphs, actually, and some mostly written rather than drawn, but even some drawn notes, yes. I wouldn't grace them with the term of wireframes, but in that direction, certainly.
Yeah.
A lot of this is, you know, it's very much back end and not so much, you know, it's an interrupt protocol for tools which will have their own visual representations of this.
Sure.
I do intend to create visual representations, don't get me wrong, but for me that's slightly separate. But I need to have enough visual representation that I can start manipulating example data.
Yeah.
And that is why I worked on syntax first, so
right.
that I could enter example data first as text before I start manipulating it.
But I can I just say one thing, that but the whole idea of event streaming is really important. So I think that's a non-trivial. So I think you got a bit more about that than you can just share in this syntax. So I think that is important.
Yes, yes. My site has a few other presentations, videos of presentations I did, and in some, look especially at the OGM one, where I did go a bit more into the event streaming and what it meant to have community values. But this is still something I'm thinking about a lot. Like, for example, dividing Speech Act into the kernel and what it's supposed to replace, which is locator dependent. That is comparatively recent in my thinking. And you won't find it in any of the existing material. These are the kinds of things I'm still working on.
Yes, but the architecture conceptually open to the decentralized or even people-centered world.
Yes, yes.
That
yes,
is
yes.
important. That is a very important aspect of it.
Yeah, yeah,
Is really, which you did talk about it at the beginning. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. I'm very, the point is to be very agnostic to implementation concerns. It's an abstract data model and eventually an interop protocol, but so that we can interoperate with including distributed web tools. Or Jerry's been the one keeping me on the distributed web track, and he's been telling me about one of the amongst many similar and related projects.
Yes, and the concept of the neighborhood as a foundational concept. You already talked about it, that that it's really the neighborhood, both in terms of the content and both in terms of the contribution, even neighborhood of communities.
Yeah.
And neighborhood of federations. Yeah.
Absolutely. I've been working on this on a very theoretical basis because I was stuck by a lot of fundamental theoretical problems. I don't think I've solved them all, but I've solved enough that I'm confident enough to get other people involved, which wasn't the case until now. And this was why I started the seminar series, because I want to transition from the really pure theory world to, okay, let's get some writing and code and be more, and this is what I want to do over the next few months to get people to see how this thing is getting more concrete. So yeah, in 2 weeks, I hope to have, I will have, that's not a hope, I will have examples of syntax and examples of, well, I hope to have a reader for that syntax. That's not a given, but I certainly will have concrete examples of syntax.
But Marc-Antoine, I didn't know about the work that you did with the society library, but there's a huge amount of real world claim structures there.
Yes.
Which should be an amazing playing ground, if you like.
No, absolutely.
I didn't know that you had
the society library is using a tool, the debate map, which was developed by someone called Venrix. It is part of a lot of the principles of debate map we're very aware of them in the Canonical Debate Lab Conversations, which is one of the groups I'm working with. The notion, by the way, of multiple scoring mechanisms, something that also was affirmed in the Canonical Debate Lab, but is also something that's been affirmed since the beginning of my work with Jack Park of Topic Quests.
But I mean, just the raw processing of huge amount of data and just getting sort of streams of claims coming from different, looks to me is an ideal ground to do actual real experiments.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
I had a question. I was curious because can you hear me before I can get going, I guess? Okay, good. Yeah, I was going to say I've been excited about, I don't know, I've been thinking how things such as community of practice applies here in this sort of progressive formalization and progression of more than, say, just formalization within communities. So I guess because there's patterns there that are maybe non sort of so deeply computer science related that are more to do with the say social protocols and community building. But anyways, I say that more or less to say I'm interested in, say, linked data or knowledge cartography or federation practices, but I'm not even sure what the sort of existing leading edge of that is. So I'm not even doing those yet. So I'm curious, what sort of little bit are you most interested in sort of extending that it seems really important? I know a bit about hypergraphs and event streams, but I'm curious in there is sort of this sort of security and sort of like, I don't know, how do you rely on streams and that sort of thing?
Right. Okay, there's many aspects to your question. The knowledge graph work I'm seeing, well, my criticism of it is that they're graphs. That means you don't have meta statements. And they're trying to have a kind of, they're building the consensus truth. And I'm not saying that's not useful, it's extremely useful, but they're not really trying to look at how to align things that may be contradictory. They're not, when they do ontology alignment, it's to create the logically consistent union of the ontologies. The notion that, well, not everything is consistent, and we have to be willing to accept the reality of chaos in our data is extremely rare. Psych is one of the few, Lennet's Psych is one of the few projects that has abandoned global consistency. What he's trying to work on is local micro-domain consistency, which has nothing to do with the kind of socially local consistency which I'm trying to express. But he's at least one of the few people who has given up on global consistency. And I think the global consistency, I understand why mathematicians and logicians want it, because it's got all these wonderful properties. But I think it's actually an obstacle to representation of social knowledge.
I think you don't need to say social to knowledge.
But I guess that wasn't exactly maybe the direction I thought you would go, because I'm curious about, I didn't realize that maybe you're saying that even with graphs, or maybe it's hypergraphs, there aren't any existing systems that enable sort of easy meta claims or whichever, and that sort of, but I was curious if
that's what I'm saying, yes.
Things like at JSON in the JSON world, and sort of how ActivityPub uses it for federation, like what is the small piece of that whole ecosystem that it's maybe not good enough, or
JSON is a very interesting piece. I spoke about offline, and I didn't name JSON by name, but basically the two emerging players in the offline annotation game are JSON and Codex, of course. I believe strongly in the value of offline annotation, but the @JSON annotation is not semantic. It's just, it can be, you can overlay semantics on it, of course, but it's not intrinsically semantic. And if you make a statement through an @JSON annotation, how do I speak about that @JSON annotation makes a statement and I want to put that in doubt? I don't think @JSON has a mechanism for that. I think Codex may allow it, and that's something I should check with Liam. He's certainly more aware of the need than most people I'm aware of.
I believe he does.
Yeah.
In terms of, you're really free to model that thing that you introduce there at a meta level, whichever way you like.
Right.
I think
No,
conceptually possibility is there. Yes.
So it's about, is this what you mentioned, and I didn't know really what you meant by concept identity. Is this sort of identities from within the stream, or?
When I speak of concept identity, it's the notion that whenever you make a claim, the claim is about certain entities, and the entities are defined as a concept, and the concept we may not speak about the same concept, even though we use the same name or the same formal identifier. I mean, formal identifiers are a bit better usually, wherever they're used. Like, for example, I was speaking to someone in biology recently. Biology is a heavy user of ontologies and formal concept identities because, frankly, they're better defined in biology than elsewhere. You know, it's this chemical, this molecule, not another one. Identity is not very contentious in that domain. But when you're speaking, I mentioned social, I mean, when you're speaking about social ideas and social claims, there's a lot of arguments about, you know, people make predictions and, oh, that prediction was realized. No, it wasn't. And what were the criteria of realizability and so on and so forth. This is where you run in real trouble. And if you're speaking about social decision making as one of the problems, and it's not that it's disjoint either, right? There's a lot of social conflict around scientific concepts that should be much better defined, but not so. And in part because we don't have a good idea of what it means to have consensus in a scientific field. And scientific fields have their own rules of consensus, and different fields have different rules, by the way.